So it's the product analytics, sorry, not product analytics, analytics section meeting, got the right thing, for October 2nd, 2023. I have the first agenda item. Wanted to tee up the technical discussion around custom events. From my product perspective, what I'm interested in is solving for some of the use cases that I've set here. We have feedback from a internal customer trying to track something like number of times GDK is updated and getting stats on that. How many users are expanding a security widget. That's a common use case for product managers at GitLab who have widgets on the MR page. And for our own, incepting the product analytics dashboard by tracking views of product analytics dashboard on product analytics dashboard. So those are three concrete use cases that I thought would help tee up the discussion, talk about what is already in place from the GDK side, or sorry, the SDK side, and what we want to do from the visualization designer side, then to display that kind of data. And it looks like, Basti, you have the first comment here about the SDK. You want to voice that over?
Yeah, sure. So that's maybe just providing some context to everyone where we're at, because I think when we set this up, it's been a while since we set this up. And so from an SDK perspective, all the SDKs allow the tracking of a custom event. They all have like a track event call. Especially for the backend SDKs, that's also the main interaction point, because there you normally don't have page views automatically being sent. And that's set up in a way that we have a schema for that set up, but it's very broad. So an event always has a custom event name, which gets extracted into a separate column. So that's already a separate column. It's initially part of the JSON that gets sent to Snowplow and then into our ClickHouse, but then it immediately gets extracted into a separate column called custom event name. And then you can send any props. So that's just an object that you send with the event, where theoretically the customer could go wild. And that's also extracted into a separate column called custom event props. Yeah, and that's all working. So these already land in the SDK. We can in the tables, we can play around with those right now. You can press track event and so on everywhere. So that's all working well. And the one thing that I'm just kind of remember or thinking about, because we have experience with Snowplow from our main setup for GitLab.com, the one that's been there for ages now. And what we're using there, and what Snowplow I think actually provides out of the box, is something called dbt to extract from a single table where we get all the events, so page views and normal events and everything else. It automatically extracts those into separate tables. So if you look into our data warehouse, the final tables that are normally used by analysts and so on for setting up your graph and so on, your dashboards, they normally include either page views or events. So those are separate tables. There's also kind of the ground floor tables of, okay, this includes just everything, but normally they kind of separate those out for easier understanding and also for query performance. And that's in theory something I think potentially we can also think about in the future, or take inspiration from the setups that Snowplow provides for dbt, to take the initial table and then separate out certain things into different tables to make it easier and potentially faster to query.
Dennis, looks like you had a response to that.
Yeah, so it was specifically about how we want to handle events in general. And right now we just collect them all into one table. Of course, we've seen some query performance concerns perhaps around, having to do full scans, and perhaps in some cases that may be necessary, or we have to put limits in place based on in other ways. But for example, for the .com project, where we've collected 100, probably 20 million events by now, and 70% of those are just page pings. That's a separate question in terms of like, yeah, what do we need, or what do we want to do with those page pings? But also, it speaks to the fact that like when we add custom events, that's going to be on top of everything else we collect, which is the majority is actually not page views. So to Boss's point about separating it in terms of optimizing query performance, there may be a time where we want to do that, which we can add to vector, for example, where we say, hey, depending on this event type, like you need to send these to different tables. I'm basically saying just, based on what solution we try to provide for the, like, if we want to call this kind of the initial like customer MVC for custom events, we should be asking that question about like, how do we want to treat event storage in the background or in our infrastructure, so that we can facilitate, and we've got a lot more to talk about below about how we want to actually like query and how we can support that. So yeah, that's my first sub point, but Rob, you've got the next.
Yeah, I spent Friday afternoon sort of deep diving into what custom events are and how we currently use them or how they're currently implemented. So feel free to read the broader overarching issue I've linked to. The comment I made in there, which is more of just me dumping things I found onto a page, more or less, but might help you out. I mean, the overarching TLDR of all this is custom events is actually 3 pieces of functionality. You've got the events themselves, which get sent to the collector, which has, as Basti's already said, we already have a kind of structure in place for how users can do that. Then you've got custom measures, which is a way to collate events into some kind of measurable thing like counts, averages, min, maxing, or using strings to concatenate things together. And then you've got dimensions, which are essentially a form of filter to help narrow the focus of what you're analyzing. And when you combine measures and dimensions together, they become what's essentially a metric. So when people talk about they're checking for a particular metric, what they're doing is they're first collating and then filtering, which is what measures and dimensions are for. So when we're thinking about how custom events works more broadly, you need to remember that we are talking essentially about 3 different pieces of underlying functionality. So we could do, but in terms of this work that we're doing, we could look at breaking this out even further and starting analyzing it at different areas, or where we can make MVC time saves within those different pieces of functionality. Out of that, I had more broader technical questions around whether we want to apply more structure to event attributes, like we already have with existing Snowplow implementation, where right now we have a more specific set of attributes like value to record a numerical value against an event, or the property, which applies more differentiation than just label, or applying additional context properties. And then what we are currently more or less doing with our custom events, where the existing Snowplow implementation has like an extra or data field where you just dump that custom events data, more or less. Basti can always correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I took from what we're currently doing. So there's a question there whether we want to make that more structured, because if we make it more structured, we can also extract more out initially. That is generic to everyone, because obviously part of the problem is if we try to extract out all custom event information, each event's going to be unique in some form or another for every user. So we can't just have a table with 100,000 columns in it, because so we could think about creating some kind of structure around that. And then unless anyone has, actually I should say, Dennis and Basti, it sounds like you're writing out your answers. So do you want to respond to that initial point? And anyone else who wants to raise their questions or could divert the discussion before I just go on a rant? Yeah.
So as far as applying structure to event attributes, I don't have a yes or no answer to that. I think I think we can all agree that that depends on what we decide to do for our MVC. I would just say, like, I guess in the spirit of kind of how we've been designing this functionality and been like kind of thinking about the users, we just want to make some like conventions that we can recommend in terms of like, are the fields that we're going to recommend. This is going to be like in terms of actually being queryable, or how we extract things similar to how we do custom event names. Like you have to use these fields or it just doesn't, I mean, it'll show up, but you can't do anything, right? You can't query it. You can't create visualizations around it. because I guess, or yeah, it can be very freeform to the detriment of the user, or it's however they decide to use it, right? But we can only support so much, especially as we kind of iterate towards whatever vision we have for custom events. So all that to say is like we can, whatever we decide, that's what we make available to. And maybe this is obvious, but I just want to reiterate. But like whatever we do support, we want to recommend these fields. Like this is what's supported. This is what we'll actually be able to query in our documentation. And then everything else, I mean, you can still collect. It will still be stored in that field, but you'd have to export that and do something different if you want to like go beyond that, which is not out of the general messaging we've been saying about how we want to design the experience around product analytics as a feature. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I like the fact that you've raised the fact that even if they do send data that isn't necessarily matching, they can still export it and do whatever they want with it, or put it in a different tool, whatever suits their needs.
Yeah, and that gets into my point further below, but we can go through your thing in terms of, yeah. Or Basti has a couple points actually. So if you want to verbalize, I can type for you.
Thanks. So two things to that. I think one, when it comes to just to reiterate that's something, I think a discussion we already had before, but still, in our current setup at GitLab, we as analytics implementation are actually thinking about enforcing more structure. So for example, enforcing that you have to have a schema for every type of prop. So getting rid of something like Rob previously mentioned, this kind of extra parameter where you can just dump whatever you want, and you would have to create a schema up front, which we can then validate again against later. Something like that would allow us kind of way down the line, if we enforce something like this, to, I guess, automatically create measures and dimensions and so on based on, hey, we expect a certain schema with a certain event. So the event, whatever its name is, would always need to send a namespace parameter, for example. Just to give an example of it, we could enforce this that way, but it requires more upfront thinking by customers. I think some of our competitors are doing that. I think specifically Amplitude does have something like a library of events upfront, but it is more effort and it makes it harder to get started. On the other hand, just I think when we think about MVCs and what we need to support in the beginning, at GitLab, 99.9% of metrics do not care about specific event parameters. So they only care about user parameters. So you want to maybe look at specific user. You want to look at, is someone a team member versus not? Is someone part of a specific namespace versus not? So the user parameters, or also location parameters, like does this happen in a specific namespace, are more important than things that are specific to an event. So that's maybe also something just for us to think about, that maybe it's not as important from a customer point of view that I can send something different with every specific event. Because worst case, the workaround is normally that I just create 2 events or 3 events or whatever. Like if I, instead of sending like some kind of string or something with the event, I could just say, okay, let's send 3 different events. And so I think that's just something to keep in mind from a priority point of view from our own learnings. There might be other companies out there. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. That was actually pretty much exactly what I found when I went through our code base. The majority of custom events that get sent through the GitLab repo are just sending an event name, a label, and that is it. They don't send any additional properties. And the ones that do, as Basti's already alluded to, more or less aren't using most of that metric. It's just, in some ways, it's just sending it because they can, and they might need it in future rather than necessarily using it right now too. So yeah, we can, I guess one thing we can take away from this is thinking about asking like the customers we are going to be onboarding or already onboarded, what data do they want to send with their custom events? Is it just labels? Is an MVC of just, as Basti suggested, having individual events just with bespoke labels for every single one, a good MVC for their use cases?
I think that solves for the 3 cases that we have. And I want to make sure that we keep in mind that while we're the biggest user today, we're not the only user. And we've definitely heard feedback both from internal and external folks that one of the hardest parts of getting started with product analytics is how much time it takes to set things up. Having heard from internal teams that it is a full milestone to get metrics set up, that's a big hurdle to doing it. And that's why so many teams don't instrument the new features that they're releasing until after the feature has been released. So anything that we can do to help simplify or keep that process as easy as possible is a good thing for us in more users sending events and more users using product analytics. So just some customer perspective there. But I think, yeah, an event and a label, I think covers for our 3 use cases that we do have concrete use cases for today.
Maybe regarding customers, just something that at a different company I did beforehand, or some analytics company asked us to do before we onboarded with them, is create a tracking plan. I don't know if we can get our current customers or better like prospective customers to do that, but I think that would also be interesting. Like they gave us some kind of schema or like an Excel sheet, and we had to kind of fill in, okay, what events do we want to track and what kind of properties do we want to set up, so that they could help us with setting up data pipelining and so on down the line. But I think something like that from our potential customers would also be interesting to understand more in detail. Like, do we really need something beyond just an event name? Yeah, I think as the feature set continues to evolve and mature, we'll get to a point where we can do that. I think that for our ideal customer, at least on the product analytics side, it's you track nothing today because you send nothing, because you have almost zero experience with product analytics. So asking you to go and figure out how you want to track all of your applications is too big of a lift. You're not going to make that investment because the payoff is there for you. As we get to a point where feature teams, not platform teams or internal tool teams, are using product analytics, that makes a ton of sense because they are thinking about that already. Maybe they've gone through that exercise with another vendor. The teams that we're working with today, making that onboarding as easy as possible is really what's going to make sure that they get on and get value out of the platform.
And I'm going to use this opportunity to skip a little bit to my point, or one of my points, is because if in terms of simplification, like it's great that we already track the JSON object from the collection point of view. And, in the longer term, especially to Rob's point, like there's more than just collecting it. There's, how do we actually derive measures from these dimensions and things like that, or derive metrics from the dimensions? But like, if that means, we could start maybe with the approach of like, you just have to send an event name every time. And then eventually, if you want to track like an additional value to that, it's more of a primitive value until we can kind of figure out the longer term solution in terms of like, you can send whatever you want. But that's definitely more of an advanced use case. Whereas like to James's point about describing like, well, getting them from 0 to something, I think, whether that's just tracking multiple events or events with like a very simplified value so that we can at least enable querying of it is kind of one of the biggest things I want us to explore. So that's, I'll stop there though. Rob, do you want to move with the rest of your points, or does anyone else have anything they'd like to add to
that? I'm happy. I can't see anyone on open their mic. So regarding to simplification, we could while retaining the current schema, if we want to make it even simpler, we could just have a documentation guideline that says we only use the label property and everything else is just ignored, but keep the same existing structure we've got now, which would simplify instrumentation's workload and our own, rather than having to try and modify the schema.
Yeah, I think at this point, there's no additional effort required from analytics instrumentation because it would just change from the configurator point of view. If we wanted to, going with like my primitive value idea, like it would just be another extraction or another field within that object that we would pull out like we do with event name. So I don't think we want to take away the collection of these things to my earlier point. Like at least we can offer the ability to export that. So yeah.
Okay. And this sort of, my next point sort of lends into this is obviously we've got a variety of SDKs right now. We've got Ruby, Python, .NET, Node, the browser. So that's JavaScript. Each of those have different language standards in terms of how you, whether you snake case, camel case, title case, different browser languages have different preferences, which you often find, especially when working within GitLab, you'll often find that the JSON returned follows that within the quotation of a key value pairing. So I thought maybe one simple, if we are looking to eventually extract out and worrying about if people are sending the same event from multiple different applications in their stack, whether we should have some kind of standardized process in terms of the key value structure and casing, sentence casing, or some kind of formatter or something that gets prepended before it goes into the database. Just so we have a consistent, if we do need to eventually do JSON blob querying, we have a consistent key that we should be hitting. Yeah, just a small little future improvement, not necessarily something for the MVC.
Yeah, just to offer an initial impression, I would say no, but like, of course, we can. Yeah, we would have to better understand the use. Like, I guess I'm a little maybe not hung up, but like if we mention like multiple applications sending events, I would expect them to kind of be like different projects, right? Because I don't think you'd have like multiple projects with multiple languages in the same. Well, that's not true. Like GitLab project is multiple languages, but I think we get what I'm saying. Like if you're instrumenting at that level, I would kind of at least initially expect like separate dashboard for each one. That's maybe definitely something we could think about, especially if we like get into the space of like group level dashboards and you want to query across multiple projects and things like that. But yeah, I think that's too far out at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, makes absolute sense. My next point is just other products, as already alluded to with the schema definitions. Google Analytics and Datadog both have preset custom events that have preset schemas that you can make use of, and they will automatically flow through the product without having to do any setup. So nothing now, just something that we could look at doing in future, or for the MVC having a very specific subset of events that we're willing to track. But it sounds like we've got an even simpler approach that we might be able to take anyway in that regard. And a more broad point, and something that sort of came to the forefront of my mind regarding like the issue with products this has been having lately with sessions data and .com. We probably should start sharing knowledge / investigating from a ClickHouse point of view and Cube, querying what sort of impact various functions and approaches might have as we scale. We'll, using ClickHouse's JSON blob extractor methods, extractor functions, have a massive impact in terms of performance, or are they negligible in the grand scheme of things, etc.? Because that would impact how the technical implementation that we would take. If there's a 30% degradation in query performance because we're querying 6 levels deep into a JSON blob, then we're probably not going to go with that approach. For instance, we'll try to figure out an alternative way or a simplified way of implementing that. So that's most likely an investigatory separate issue that we probably want to tackle before we think about implementing custom events in a more complex manner. And Dennis is writing a point. You can't write and type.
No. And I'm also like, I was trying to listen, and I think I'm like about to repeat the same thing twice. Also, I want to make sure that we're also running low on time, and I want to get to Yevgen's point. I'm just going to quickly summarize. Agree. That's why, like, with custom events, I'm thinking like, okay, we can continue to collect what we collect, but maybe we don't explore, or we should explore the impact of JSON blob querying before we like introduce it, because to your point, like we are doing a bunch of other stuff. The sessions queries are expensive. But like, you know, theoretically, like ClickHouse supports querying JSON blobs and things like that. But like, what is the impact of that when you query 10,000, 100,000, a million rows across like, how much time? And maybe it's not a deal breaker. And this is getting to my other point, but like we have to understand the impact of that so we can potentially introduce limits around it so that we, yeah. But anyways, Rob, well, sorry, Yevgen, you're typing. But we can.
No,
we can
I was just.
Yeah.
You just mentioned my point. I don't mind to share later asynchronously, and we can check there.
Okay. Well, we're well on time, anyways. I guess Rob, you've made some recommendations for potential MVC ideas. Given how much time we have left, perhaps it's good to just kind of call more attention to the issue itself, so we can kind of continue the discussion there. How do we feel about that?
Yeah, I apologize for ranting. I do
No.
apologize.
It was all. This is what we need to. This is the discussion we've needed to have for several months now. Like to Basti's point, like we introduced custom events, and we're like, we're gonna need this, but we haven't really thought about it. And now we're getting the important thing is that we're discussing it now because we're getting closer and closer to launching a live service. And as we do that, we need to think about how we want to handle custom events so we can actually introduce the functionality to users, but we also have to be a little more mindful about the impact it'll have now that we're getting closer to beta and eventually GA. So to that end, take a look at the issue that was linked above. I think Rob has the link there. The discussion was great. I had a question around page pings just because I'm curious if we're going to use them for anything. It's great because we're collecting tons of data, but yeah, we can handle async. But anyways.
I just want to say, please, anyone else, don't make it a single Rob show because that would be a terrible idea for our product. Feel free to comment, disagree, add further suggestions. I'd love to see what everyone else has to think.
Awesome. Well, we're about out of time. Any other points that anyone would like to bring up? All right, I'm trying to talk. I can't talk and type at the same time. So thanks everyone for joining this section meeting. Hope you have a good rest of your Monday and a good rest of your week. Take care.
Yeah, everyone.
Yeah.